any Christmas card that you ever have gotten that had a religious picture on the front, that had a picture of a nativity scene, had a great, big, massive star over the stable, didn't it? Usually with sort of some light beams coming down over the stable or over the manger there. It's standard practice. There are all kinds of songs about it. Rise Up, Shepherds, and Follow is one of the spirituals, and it talks about there's a star in the east on Christmas morn. And we think about the Star of Bethlehem as being really large. Now, of course, most of the secular world has stopped thinking about the wise men, has stopped thinking about Christmas altogether. But in the church, December the 25th is the first day of Christmas. And so the 12th day of Christmas is not until January the 5th, and then, at least in the Western church, we celebrate the wise men's arrival on January the 6th. And so this is one of those days when we read the story of the wise men. And it's important to read that story again because you may have noticed something, now that I've mentioned it, about the star in Matthew. Matthew does not say that it was a great big star. Does not say that it outshone every other star in the sky. You and I get that image from a gospel that did not make it into the Bible. We now call it the proto-evangelism of James, or the Gospel of James. But it did not make the cut into the Bible. If you ever read the Gospel of James, you will understand why it's weird. It's really weird. It has all kinds of weird things. And it did not make the cut in terms of making it into our Bible. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We do not have the Gospel of James, or the proto-evangelism of James. But the proto-evangelism of James is the one that talks about the fact that the star was larger than any other star in the sky. And that book, called the Gospel of James, probably was not written until at least the second, maybe third century after Jesus. And so he didn't know. Our guess is he probably picked up some of the legendary stuff that had been told from person to person through the years, and then began to write all that down. And so you and I owe all of our Christmas cards with gargantuan stars on them to a gospel that didn't make it into the Bible. Which means we have to go back to the Bible then and look at Matthew. And you just heard all there is to hear about the Star of Bethlehem. That's it. Matthew did not bother describing it. He did not say it was larger than any other star. All he said was that somebody saw it rising. Now it's very interesting. At Cornell University, they have an astronomy department, evidently a pretty good one. And the Cornell astronomy department estimates that every year in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, there is one new star that is born. Now, interestingly enough, they don't talk about an individual star. They say that there's a gaseous anomaly that gives birth to stars. And there can be all kinds and all different numbers of stars, from one to whatever. But one of these activities, at least per year, happens in our neck of the woods, in our Milky Way. Sometimes 3. But if we're going to talk about averages, we want to stick with 1, because 1's easier to handle. So at least one new star every year in our Milky Way galaxy. Now, the University of Florida, as it turns out, also has an astronomy department, and evidently a fairly strong one. And they tell us that of all the galaxies that can be observed in the current known universe, there are about 100 billion galaxies. And in each of those galaxies, about once a year, there is this happening that gives birth to one or more stars. So the reality is that there are about 100 billion stars that are born every year. You divide that by 365 and that comes out to a whole lot per day. Now, of course, Cornell and the University of Florida have the benefit of a telescope. They have the benefit of a lot of telescopes, as a matter of fact. What they do not have the benefit of is nice dark skies. Now, 2,000 years ago, the Magi, in most of our translations it says wise men, but my translation has a little footnote. It says Magi. And the Magi were primarily in Persia. And these men, they were all men, studied the night sky, and they did not have any light pollution to deal with. There were no cities. There were no car headlights. There were no radio towers with red lights to ward off the airplanes. There was none of that nonsense. All they had to do was to look up at night, and they were able to see the stars. And evidently they did a really good job of watching the stars. They understood the movement of the stars during the seasons. They understood what you and I now call planets, which comes from a word that means a wandering star, because the planets move in and out and hold a different orbit from the rest of the stars as we see them. But here are these magi, these wise men, who have been observing the night sky long enough to notice that there's a new star. Now, I would think that the odds are pretty good that that star was, approximately the same size as every other star that we see in the sky. And you and I have gotten used to stars. The number 100 billion doesn't even bother us anymore. We all go to school, and somewhere in science class, we take some astronomy. We learn the names of the planets, although we do argue about how many planets there are. And we learn stars are gaseous balls of fire. Now, there may be 100 billion stars being born every year, but the scientists also say there are about 100 billion that die every year as well, so it's sort of a trade-off. But these magi, without the benefit of telescopes, without the benefit of satellite, were studying the sky closely enough that when something as ordinary, as it turns out, as a new star happens, they notice it. Now, the Magi are not necessarily what you and I would call astronomers, scientists who study stars. The Magi were basically what you and I would now call astrologers. I don't know if you take the paper anymore, but my horoscope is on the paper every day, just above the comic section. And usually I don't read it. Occasionally I will glance at it, usually just for a laugh. Because I don't really think that the movement of the stars and the planets and whatever is going to affect the way I make decisions. But the Magi did think that. They believed that whatever was happening in the sky, something on earth was going to be affected by it. And when they see a new star rising in the east, they come to the conclusion that there is a new king that has been born, and given the position of the star, it must be over Judah. And that means there's a new king of the Jews. Now, you and I would hesitate about that sort of interpretation. But let's face it, even the astrologers get it right once in a while. And these astrologers got it right. And they got it right because they were paying attention to something very ordinary. The night sky and a new star. There are 100 billion new stars every year. Not sure we can see them all from here, but I bet we can see a lot of them. And somebody 2,000 years ago was paying attention to that. And the Magi did not necessarily know the name of God the way you and I understand God, but they understood that God was working in something as ordinary as a new star. and maybe they ought to pay attention. I have a suggestion, since it's New Year's Day especially. I have a suggestion for a New Year's resolution for you, if you haven't made one already. And if you made the usual, oh, I'm going to eat less and exercise more, then when that one falls apart in about 2 weeks, you can adopt this one. This is my resolution, and I would commend it to you. I resolve that every day I will look how God is working in ordinary things. I resolve every day I will look for how God is working in ordinary things. Now, I think that's one of those resolutions that when you forget to do it one day, you can pick it right back up the next day and basically no harm done. You might be even able to look back on that prior day and go, oh, I wasn't paying attention and God was working in this ordinary thing. And I missed it. I'm not going to miss it today. I resolve that every day I'm going to look for how God is working in ordinary things. I'm going to start, I think, by looking at how God is working in the ordinary people that you and I sit next to every week. You and I sit next to them all the time. And after a while, we get used to it. When they're not in their usual pews, we miss them, we check up to see how they're doing. But the reality is you are sitting next to someone extraordinary. You are sitting next to a unique creation of God. And God is working in that person in a way that maybe you haven't paid attention to yet. And it's time. I resolve that I am going to look every day for how God is working in ordinary things. Maybe something as ordinary as prayer. For you and me as the people of God, prayer should just be basically an everyday, practically all the time thing. We take it for granted. Well, yeah, we pray. But God is working through those prayers. And sometimes we haven't paid attention to how God is working in those prayers. And maybe in the new year, it's time to start paying attention to how God works through prayer. I resolve every day to look how God is working in everyday things, in ordinary things. And we can start right now. Because it's time today to pay attention to how God is going to act in something as ordinary as bread. Because when you and I gather as the people of God in faith, then bread is something ordinary that begins to show the work of God. And in a few moments we will come forward and we will take communion together. And we will take something as ordinary as bread and we will ask God to work through that bread and to work through the juice and to work through us. So that the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The ordinary is where God is at work. In the 8:45 service today, one of the women was showing off on her phone the picture of the new grandbaby. And the reality is that babies are fairly ordinary. They happen all the time. In terms of people being born faster than people are dying. But if you don't think that God works in something as ordinary as a baby, then you may have missed the meaning of Christmas in the first place. So I invite you to a New Year's resolution for all year, that when you forget it for a day or a week, you pick it right back up. I resolve that every day I will look for God's work in ordinary things. ordinary things that you and I use all the time is language, words. And our words can be very ordinary. Hi, how are you? It's good to see you today. I will give you a quick lesson in welcoming in the church. Please, please, do not ever let the words, "Where have you been?" pass your lips. Because those words have power too. And if you start off that way, that's accusatory, and that means the church becomes associated with guilt. And that's not where any of us want to be headed. To say, "Welcome, I'm glad to see you. I've missed you. Are you doing better?" Those are words that welcome, because words have power. Because God works in something as ordinary as words. And if you don't think that's right, then you need to crack your Bible over to the first chapter of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Because God works in ordinary things, even in things like words.